Hello and welcome to the 7th and final session of the Church Communications Strategy Training course. My name is Peter Frank and I will be leading our session like I have this entire course. As a quick reminder, I am the Senior Manager of Marketing Technology here at Concordia Publishing House. My contact information is up on the screen. You are welcome to reach out to me at any time using that email address. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me. I always love hearing from people who participated in the course, finding out what was most valuable, finding out if there's something I could have changed, or maybe there's a waste of time, I could have cut it out. I'm going to put my information on the screen again at the end of the session, just asking you for your feedback, but I wanted to put a plug in for that right off at the bat. So as you're going through this course, think back to the last 7 or 6 sessions before today and including today, and let me know what was most valuable, what you put into practice already, what you're hoping to or excited to put into practice, and then what kind of things you would have done if you were leading the class to improve it. Uh-oh, apparently I am muting and unmuting myself. Never heard that before. I should be okay. If you are hearing me, then we're all set. A few housekeeping items before we begin. I'm planning 55 minutes for presentation, 15 questions for Q&A at the end. I've been going over all of that a little bit. 55 is a little bit closer to where I've been, but I'm happy to stick around as long as I need to for the question and answers. You are welcome to stick around as well, but I won't be offended if you leave after that 55-minute mark. In fact, I won't be offended if you leave before that. Now, all attendees are muted. Hopefully, I'm not muted like the little voice just said. So if you can't hear me, you're not going to hear these instructions. But if you can hear me, we should be in good shape. All right, I do ask that you ask questions throughout. And there's a questions part of the GoToWebinar panel where you can enter in your question. I'll see it up here. I'll get to it as it's kind of like a queue. I'll get to it at the very end. So feel free as you're thinking of things to put them in the chat. And one of my associates, James, is on the line as well. He'll be able to answer any questions, especially if there's technical difficulties or anything like that. So feel free to put your questions in as we go. We are recording this webinar like we've recorded all of the others, and I did hit the start record button. I always like to check that to make sure. This will be going into our resource center, just like the other sessions. Now, I will point out that right now I'm putting the latest sessions at the top, or the most recent ones. After today, I'm going to resort everything, make it chronological, because we are going to have that resource center available for a while, but it's going to make the most sense if we do session 1 through the end. I didn't want to put all of the, just have it be session 1 at the top as I'm sending these out on a weekly basis. So just know that change is coming. Here was our schedule. Today we're at campaigns, that last and final session. And as a nice reminder, these sessions are all about tools for you to use to create a strategy for your church communications. And I ask that you use them as appropriate. I'm not telling you that you have to use every single one. Some of these will work better for some people and better for some situations. So just know that they are tools that you can use really in any combination, but I want to give you as many tools as possible. And today will be that same thing. But before we get into our topic at hand, let's go back a week to session 6. We talked about church websites creating your home base. And it was really a broader discussion than that as we talked about a content framework. So content framework in the simplest of terms is a strategy for sharing content. And it looks like this and the nice visual that I put together based on what I learned from Chris Brogan, a speaker that I attended a session at. He's a well-known writer and blogger and podcaster. He's got a lot of great content out there. Now, he wasn't talking about church communications, but it has absolute practical implications. So we talked about our outposts, which is where you go to have conversations with your audience, where you go to where they are. And then we got into media empire and home base. That was last week. So as we look at our content map, really, these different stages of the framework fit perfectly. The outpost is all about finding your audience, going where they are, your personas. As you can see, we have 3 sample personas there. Your media empire is all about your actual content, long format, one-way conversations. Talk about that briefly in a moment. And then finally, your home base is where conversions happen. That's where you're drawing people in. That's where you get them to take actions, and those actions should lead them farther on the journey map. I know I sound like a broken record, but this is our recap session. We're going to be looking at these three things again as we put together a campaign and how they all flow together. So I want you to be familiar with this before we get to that point. All right, so again, the media empire, we call it correspondence or long format one-way communications. It's where your audience finds your messages, but finding it is not enough. Those messages have to provide value, and value specifically to your personas. If you don't know your audience very well, you can't provide the true value for them. Your church's media empire provides the format that is most appropriate for the content. And we looked at three different kinds of format. Blogs, which are very much written content. Now you can have other aspects of media in them, but first and foremost, we consider it the written word. They're not just for personal opinions. We went through a number of different examples, applying God's word to daily living, stories of past events, sermons, answering common questions, etc. YouTube or videos as a whole, I put the YouTube logo on there because everybody knows that goes in with videos, but they can supplement or even replace your blog as part of your media empire. And again, they have those same qualities, latest content at the top. You can sort them in a playlist to get really specific content for your audience. And it can be a long format. Longer videos do very well. It holds people's attention if the value is there. And then finally, we talked about a well-executed email strategy. Now, this is kind of a traditional digital tactic. It's been around for as long as anyone has been familiar with the internet, but it still works today. Now, it's still effective because of these different factors, giving control to the recipient, being urgent or time insensitive. You can let an email sit there for a few days and still go back to it. It's more private than other channels, and you have a lot of options for creativity in terms of design and style. Now, we talked about the canned spam app. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail. You can certainly look that up on your own. But the most important part of it is that the spirit of the law can apply, even if the letter of the law doesn't. It's the best thing for your audience, and the best thing for your audience is always what's best for your church. Then we jumped into home base, which is where your audience converts, moves along that journey map. In our terms, it's your church website. That's where you're drawing everybody there. That's your home base. Now, you direct the different personas there to take the next step, but the content that leads them there is what really draws them in, and that next step should be relevant based on that content. You've already piqued their interest. Now you ask them to take the next action. It can also serve as your media empire and even as an outpost. Your church website can hold videos and blog content, and as we'll talk about in just a second, it can be a way to draw your audience in. A little bit different than like social media. Again, it's to generate conversions first and foremost, and that's this last step here. So as you look at your audience taking those subsequent steps from one stage to the next, that is done through conversions on your website. What does that actually look like? Well, it's really just signing up for emails, requesting additional information, registering for an event. All of those are forms, and those forms can come in a variety of different ways, even if you have offline actions that you're tracking. So a lot of times it's registering for an event. And so if you think about, well, do I want people to call to register or register on my website? I'd always recommend you defer to register on your website because you can automatically track that. It saves time for you, and it allows you to see where your audience is at. Now, some of these other ones at the very end, like becoming a confirmed member or attending worship or Bible study regularly, you can track those digitally, but you don't necessarily need people to fill out a form and say, well, I've been coming to worship every few weeks. You can track that based on their actions in other ways. Now, again, we mentioned this before, the content in your media empire should support the actions you want your audience to take. And your church website can also play a critical role in that outpost when it comes to organic and paid search. And so we talked about how your website can answer people's questions, and when they ask those questions in a search engine, your website can come up. But of course, that means that your website needs to come up, and the way to do that is through search engine optimization. So we talked about what search engine optimization is. It's about showing up at the top of search engine result page by improving your website. And there's 4 pillars. We're not going to go into them in great detail. Technical SEO is all about making sure your site loads quickly, looks good on mobile devices, the real nitty-gritty technical stuff. The content, that goes back to your media empire, making sure you have relevant content for your audience, not that you think it's relevant, but that they do by interacting with it, staying on the site, all of those sort of things. Now, on-site SEO is all about optimizing your headers and the structure of your content. Off-site SEO is all about people linking to your site. I could talk about SEO all day, and I'm not going to, so we'll keep moving on. But I think the thing you'll probably be asking is, why do we care so much about search engines? That goes back to what we talked about with CAN-SPAM. What's best for search engines is best for your audience. What's best for your audience is what's best for your church, at least in terms of what we're talking about in communications, but I think that can be played out even farther than that. Again, we're in the business of sharing the gospel. That is what's best for our audience. It's also what's best for our church. So I think it all ties together nicely. All right, that's the recap. There's a lot of slides. I apologize. There was just a lot of stuff to cover last week. Today, we're getting into campaigns, scheduling your communications. And this is taking everything we've learned. You'll see aspects of it throughout today, putting it into really a tangible plan. Now, I'm not actually going to write a communications campaign calendar today and show you that, but I'm going to talk about the decision-making processes you can go through in developing your own communications campaign calendar. So the communications calendar is first and foremost, and I would guess most of you have this in some form, whether it is digital or it is a calendar on the wall written with sticky notes or on a whiteboard. I've seen that in a lot of different churches where it's a central point of all of the communication efforts or just the events that are taking place. We're going to focus on communication and the steps needed to get to that point of the events, which you're doing beforehand to draw interest. So let's ask the why. I would guess you all know these, but it's good to rehash them. And there might be some things that stick out. First off, it allows you to plan your time. Just like any other form of calendar, it allows you to allocate your most important resource that you can't gain, which is time. As you look at your day-to-day life, you have a fixed number of hours, and some things always happen. You always need to sleep. You always need to eat. You need to spend time with your family. You need to spend time resting. All of those things play into it. And so if we try to gain more time, we're cutting into something else more valuable. But if we manage the time we have allotted, it allows us to not only do a good job in our work and communications, but do a better job in our other vocations where having dedicated time is critical. And I don't know about you, but I struggle with this and have struggled with it for a long time. And I've really tried to prioritize it. And I see the benefits of managing my time. For some reason, I always default to trying to pack too much in. But being organized is really the best way for me to manage my time because at least I know everything's covered. And so in my off time, I know that I've structured out my work time well. And if you think about that, especially if your role in the church is not 100% dedicated to communications, or again, I'll say church, school, nonprofit, any of those organizations, it's all the same. If you divide your time between communications and something else, you never want to shortchange one for the other. So scheduling out your time will allow you to really give the best to each of your tasks. It also ensures that you don't miss or shortchange key events. Now, I have never fully missed a key communications event, either in my work or things that go on at my church. And I'm guessing you probably haven't either. I'm guessing Easter didn't sneak up on you and all of a sudden you said, yeah, we should probably tell people about it. But I would guess that you've shortchanged key events in your church, and probably more than once. Or at the very least, you look back after the fact and think, I could have done better. There's opportunities that I missed. Well, there's always going to be more and more that you can do, but if you can look back and see that you hit the most important ones preparing for that key event, then I think you can rest easy and you can improve your processes for the next time. We're going to talk about that. It also shows where your capacity has reached its limits. This goes back into managing your time, but also as a church. If you start seeing that your communications calendar is so full of efforts, then that might mean that your church is so full of efforts and you need to scale back a little bit. You can't possibly add more and have it be affected because your audience's attention is going to be divided based on your communications. And so your communications can be indicative of more than just your time, but it can also be indicative of what's going on at your church. Finally, it allows you to create a cadence that your audience will learn. Now, I have to admit something here. This word has been used quite regularly around the office here at CPH. And I don't have the largest vocabulary. When it first came out, I was like, what's cadence? Now, I know languages. I took a lot of languages in college, which I blame for my English suffering. And so I had to look up what cadence was, and it made sense. I could kind of pick up on it from the context. But if you're like me and you don't know what cadence is, I'll define it in just a moment. But once I realized that the definition was tied back to music, it made a lot more sense why I didn't know it, because music makes no sense to me whatsoever. But cadence, according to dictionary.com, is the flow or rhythm of events, especially the pattern in which something is experienced. So when you think about music, which is always a challenge for me, I can listen to music. My wife makes fun of me because I can listen to the same song over and over and over again and not remember a single word in the lyrics just because it doesn't register with me. But there's that rhythm, that flow that is very nice and relaxing. And for many people, it just causes them to focus in. I like having music in the background to focus. When you think about your communications and your audience, this can be a wonderful tool where people expect to hear from you, which means their attention is tuned in at that time. And if you go outside the cadence, you can draw their attention for something special. And so you have this nice balance of things that are being expected and things that are surprising, not in a bad way, but in a, oh, I'm going to tune in my attention. So that's what cadence is. And the more we've talked about it and implemented it here at CPH, the more I see the value. And especially in churches and schools, you have that rhythm of the church year or the school year, which really allows you to set a nice cadence. Now, depending on your nonprofit organization, you might have some things that allow you to do that in the same way. I think that's going to be a little bit tougher there, just because in most nonprofit situations, you don't have that regular structure outside of what you're doing. You might have the holiday calendar and all of that, but that's not quite as particular as the church or school year. All right, so what should you include in your communications calendar? And I've tried to make this as visual as possible because this helps me kind of get everything nice and structured. I hope it helps you as well. So first, start with the big picture. Now you might be tempted, like I am, to look at things on a month by month and maybe a quarter by quarter basis. I really like to block everything out. And that goes far beyond just calendars. I love Microsoft Excel. I just like to say that I see the world in rows and columns. That's just kind of how I compartmentalize everything. It really works for me. In church communications, though, if you segment it too much, well, for one, you miss that cadence, and you'll see that as we go. But you also are probably shortchanging things because not everything that you communicate has the same weight to it. So what I'd recommend is looking at it a little bit different. And I think, again, this works very well for the church and school. We're going to look at it for the church, but I think the school is pretty parallel. From a nonprofit standpoint, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but you might be able to do something similarly. So what I'd recommend, and I hit my animation too quickly, start with, rather than quarters and months, put it into different seasons. And I'm doing 3 different seasons here: Easter, summer, and Christmas. And rather than looking at it as a month by month basis, I'm going to put it in more of a grouping of these seasons and add a timeline to it. Now, I don't know if you can see that as well. I've got the little hash marks at the bottom. But as you look at this, the reason that you put it in this way is because it all kind of leads to a big event. And so that's what we call the tent poles of communication. I heard about this first from one of our blog authors on Concordia Technology's blog. And I really like this idea of these tent poles. When you think about building a tent, you have some key poles that if you don't put up, everything else falls apart. And we have that in the church, whether it's a major church holiday or events that take place at your church that are so important that if you missed it, you'd be out of a job. Those are what we call the tent poles. And so as you look at this kind of structure, you can put those tent poles of Easter and what I'm calling Rally Day. You may not call it Rally Day, but that end of the summer, you want to draw people back in. If you're at a school, well, that's the first day of school. That's the launch of the new school year. All of that is very familiar, but you got to hit that right. And kind of think of a skier going down a slope towards a jump. If you don't hit that jump, you're going to stumble the whole way down. You may still get to the bottom, but that's not the way you want to get there. So you got to hit these at the right time. And so obviously Christmas is the last one. Now, these are not going to align perfectly on your calendar. I made it nice and even structured. It's going to be a little bit off. But as you think about these key tent poles in your church, these are where you want to get it right. And it can't be the only thing, because there's more that goes on the rest of the time. So the next thing is what I'm calling micro campaigns. And I'm going to put these as events that are important to your church. Now, some of these might be important to all churches, but I think as you'll see, they're not at that same level of an Easter or Christmas or even the Rally Day, the beginning of the new school year or church year. So things like maybe an annual fundraiser that you do. We've got something like that every January at my church. Might be something like Ash Wednesday, kicking off the Lenten season. Mother's Day is a very big communication day. That's something as I've been following different Facebook pages or Facebook groups over the years. My church doesn't really do much with Mother's Day, but I didn't realize it's a very big event at a lot of churches, photo booths and everything else. That's news to me, or at least it was several years ago. Pentecost, VBS, Reformation, if you're Lutheran. If you're not Lutheran, then that might not be as big of a day for you. Thanksgiving. These are all different kinds of what I would call micro campaigns, meaning they are out of the ordinary. You only have this happening once in a while. You need to put some extra effort behind planning for these things, but it's not so much that if you didn't do a good job, you would be out of a job. It's one of those things where it's important to put enough energy and effort to get it right, but it's not as bad as missing Easter. Something like that. Now, I think a lot of your church goals will go into this if they're more events-based, because they are not things that happen on a regular periodic basis. Depending on what your goals are, if you're going to have like a quarterly community outreach event, well, yeah, that would definitely fit into one of these. If you're trying to increase Bible study attendance by 35%, well, that goes kind of that Rally Day. Makes it almost even more important because of your goals. So it might fit in to either one of these. Now, the next thing is your ongoing efforts. And this would include your weekly service. This would include things like Bible studies. This might even be just your regular cadence at the school of how you communicate things. I know at our school, we have what we call a principal's pad that comes out on a weekly basis. It's kind of like a newsletter, because it is a newsletter. It's a good way to communicate with everybody. And so as you add these in, you're gonna, fill your calendar up super quickly. And I've used a lot of animation because it's fun and it draws your eye into these things. But I think especially this one, it just keeps going and you realize how much you are doing over the course of a year. Now, I think I've shared this quote with you before. Pastor Jacob Hoyer shared, and I think he got it from somewhere else, but he had a fantastic quote saying, we tend to overestimate what we can get done in a day and underestimate what we can do. Let me step back. We tend to overestimate what we can get done in a day and underestimate what we can get done in a year. And what I like with this view is we can see exactly how much we do over the course of an entire year. And it should help put things into perspective. Because if you're feeling tired as a church communications person, this is why. There is a lot that's going on. Well, let's take another step out. You want to add time to work on your content map. We talked about this several weeks ago. Let me pull this back up. As we were talking about the content map, I mentioned that many of you will already have content for different personas at different stages. Ideally, we'll get to the point where we have something for everything, but you'll probably look at your communications and say, all right, well, we've got this one piece or this one type of email that we do that fits everybody that comes into our fellowship events. And we've got some things, well, this doesn't, we would never send that to this persona, but we'll send it to these other ones. And so you've got this kind of mishmash of communication efforts. And our goal is to have one thing for each persona at each stage that's relevant for them, both as to who they are and where they're at in the journey map. And that's a big project. And when you look at what we just looked at in terms of what you're already doing with communication efforts, it's going to be hard to fit that in. So I recommend, as you plan out your communication calendar, you look at those timeframes where you have a little bit of space. So in this case, during the Easter season, you've got time kind of in that mid-March, closer to April range for focusing on one persona. And then maybe towards the end of the summer, you focus on one stage, that prospect stage, and get that just right. Especially as it leads into the new year, you'll have that ready to go. And then as you get into Christmas, new members, a lot of times around Reformation, you welcome new members. Maybe that's the time that you focus on that stage. And this could be a couple-year project, but every time you do it, you're getting better and better. So you start filling up your calendar at a high level, starting with the things that are most important and working your way down and getting to that point where you have these optional things. Well, then as you take a step back, let's split these all up a little bit. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, there's just a few dots along there. On the one hand, there's a lot going on, but if you look at any single section, there's not that much going on. Well, that's where you get into this kind of Gantt chart. If you're not familiar with a Gantt chart, it looks sort of like this, where you have your start and end of your work. The bullet points or the dots on there show when things happen, when they launch. But a Gantt chart will allow you to see what's going on simultaneously. And I didn't put this on there because it'd be really cluttered, but I guess it'd be reality. Your ongoing efforts also have some time, and whether that's a week for each one or a week and a half and you have a lot of overlap, that happens too. But you want to give yourself a good view of what's going on in terms of the amount of effort for each. And as you'll see, some of these will take longer than others. And so you might be planning for Easter before Ash Wednesday even starts. Depends on how big you want to do it. So putting in this perspective will hopefully help you understand where your limits are. Now, let's shift gears a little bit. Each item on these calendars, each one of those lines and dots becomes what I call a campaign. And I shouldn't say what I call, what a lot of people call a campaign, but I want to define campaign because sometimes the word campaign in a church refers to fundraising, and that's not what we're talking about. Sometimes in business, a campaign is all about sales and putting efforts towards sales. And it's not that either. But I like to call this a campaign because it fits into a broad spectrum. So campaigns really focus on a few different things. So what do we include in each campaign? Or what should we plan out for each campaign? The first thing I want to talk through is the details. And I do this in a very Excel-like manner. We've moved into a tool that I'll mention again at the end. I'll provide the link, but I mentioned it last week, called Airtable. It's an online database software, and what we have done is planned out everything for each campaign in these very different formats. So a campaign is listed, and it has some specific details, and I'll go through some of the key ones in just a few moments. But it's all about that effort. And if you think about it, whether you're doing Easter or the third Sunday after Pentecost, you have similar details that you're going to have to work out. We'll look at those in a moment. The next thing is what I call tactics. Tactics are each individual communication effort, and this really gets into our content framework. What are those actual actions that you're doing? Another way we look at tactics is when somebody from our audience receives a message. It's not all the actions that lead to that. It's that point of communication when the audience actually hears our message. But the things that lead to that are what I call tasks. And so you have a to-do list for every single tactic. And I think you'll see as we get into this, it starts to really make sense why you always feel like you're running around doing a bunch of things, because you are. There's a lot that goes into this. Let's talk about details first. So thinking about each individual campaign, there's things you need to plan out. You need to know who your persona or your audience is. Now, for many of these, it's going to be everyone in your church, but that becomes a bit too broad in general. And so as you look at your campaigns, sometimes you might want to focus on just one or two personas, or maybe you're still going to send it out to all your personas, but you figure out the different ways to communicate based on who that persona is. And so I encourage you to start with that and say, who is really impacted by this campaign? Not just send it to everybody. I'm sure if they don't want to know about it, somebody they know will, so they can forward it. Don't use that. Focus on whose this is most relevant for. And then what is that primary message? Go back to your message map. What are you trying to communicate? This is the time where you start to see if there's something that's incongruent. Well, if you get to a campaign and you either struggle with what the primary message is, or struggle to figure out how it points back to your goals or to your mission statement, if you don't have that thought process and you just go about doing it, you'll do everything. But if you put this in here and say, how does this tie back to what we are about as an organization, as a church or a school or nonprofit? If you can easily tie it back to it, then it's a worthy campaign. But if you can't, that's a warning sign that you might be about to waste your effort. And so doing this at the start of a campaign is far better than at the very end when you say, I've done all that work and it doesn't mean a thing. Well, if you have your primary message, then you know your talking points. And if you have a team of people working on this, getting those talking points right is going to be key. For one, having all those talking points listed is going to make sure nothing gets missed. But it also is going to make sure that they're the right talking points. So if you have a date and a time and a location, well, everybody needs to know that. And you should be communicating it in the same way across all of your different tactics. This campaign detail becomes the source of truth for that campaign. Start date, end date. This is how you figure out your Gantt chart. When do you start working on this? What is enough time? You don't want to be thinking about this and everything else all the time. By having a start date, it gives you that opportunity to say, all right, we're going to begin planning for this. So I'll let my creativity flow. I'll start putting ideas away, but I'm not going to actually start doing anything until I get to that date. Now, I don't know if you're like me. Sometimes I get very excited about a new campaign or a new effort, and I start working on that right away. And then I miss something else that's due sooner because I was so excited about that. There's campaigns that we like and campaigns that we don't like, and we tend to focus more of our energy and attention on the things we do. Start date gives you that kind of criteria to say, all right, you've planned enough time to work on this. Don't start working on it until it's the right time. And of course, the end date is really one of those critical talking points. Like, when are we done with this? We don't want to miss it. And then finally, people responsible. Getting others involved. Even if you are a team of one on the communications team, if you can find other volunteers or people who are critical to the process, identify them up front so that you're not surprising them. There's a lot of people who participate in communications at the church, even if they don't have that communications title in their job description or in their role. So figure out who all is involved and make sure they're aware of the details too, or at the very least, aware of the timing. All right, the next thing is tactics. Here are some ideas for tactics that you might include in a campaign. None of these should come as a surprise to you. Things like social media posts, social media ads, blog posts, videos, emails, website pages, landing pages, which are website pages with forms on them, downloads, maybe a PDF, bulletin articles, mailings, signage, and announcements. Those are just a few ideas. I'm sure you have plenty of others that you do. Well, in order to accomplish those different tactics, there are several different kinds of tasks that need to be completed. Things like copywriting, content review, proofreading, design, list determination, scheduling it, printing it, mailing it, depending on what you do, any number of these. It's not enough to just write an email. Somebody has to also provide some level of design if you're going to have it look nice. Somebody should be proofreading it. Somebody should be reviewing the content, make sure it's accurate and theologically correct. That's something that in the church we have to remember, is that we're not full of theologians. We often have people who need a little bit of help in that area. Determining who it should go to and actually scheduling that, I mean, that's just for an email alone. And then you start looking at these other tasks. There's a lot that goes into this. So are you overwhelmed yet? I felt a little bad as I started typing all of these out because I left things off, really just in the interest of space. I didn't want to just have everything as a size 12 font. There's so many things that we can and we should be doing and that we do actually do in terms of communication, and it gets overwhelming. I think that's probably the most common thing that I hear is there's not enough time to do everything that we need to do. And that leads to the next point, which is campaign templates. They are here to help. Campaign templates is a way of working that allows you to find what works best for you and make it repeatable. There's no silver bullets here, but it starts to become more like a recipe, where once you've made it the first time, you can tweak it and you can improve it, but you have a much better idea of how to do it. I've been doing a lot of cooking over the last year, and one of the things that prevented me from cooking to start was the initial investment in both ingredients, having a spice cabinet full, but then also the time of learning it. And it's amazing how after the first time I make a recipe, the second time it goes so much quicker. Now, I'm pretty careful as I go about it and make sure to cut everything up first and get everything prepared before I throw it into the stove or the oven or whatever. But once I become familiar with a recipe, I know exactly what to do and how much time it's going to take me, and I can move through more efficiently. And that's what campaign templates are all about. They are predetermined sets of tactics, and they're based on your journey map. And so you always have this idea, this nice structure in place so that it can become repeatable. So let's give an example. Let's look at our journey map here. If you plan out different campaigns that happen on a regular basis, maybe you have a fellowship event campaign template, and you are doing 3 or 4 of these a year. It's not on a weekly basis. It doesn't become a routine or a habit, but you think about all the things that you have to do. And I look at our church. We have a fantastic trunk or treat every year, and it continues to grow, and it's a great opportunity. I don't know, where I grew up, trunk or treats weren't really a thing, but here in St. Louis, there's quite a few of them, so much so that on Halloween, we don't get many trick-or-treaters. People just go to these events. But what a great opportunity at a church level to have people from your community coming onto your campus. You can ask them to sign up ahead of time so that you can have enough gift bags or candy to go out. There's enough communication that you can make it a really good event for the people who are coming, but also as a way to share the love of Christ through your service of that event. So you have this same kind of campaign that happens once a year. It's very similar to what we do with our Easter egg hunt and some of our other outreach activities. If we put this into a template and an idea that we know exactly what steps we have to take, then it's just like dusting off that recipe each time saying, okay, here is our checklist of things to do. And so I recommend looking at what your communications are and figuring out, some of these campaigns will span multiple journey stages where you're taking somebody from attending worship to the first time all the way to the new member class. And maybe it's not a campaign that is added to your calendar, but is a series of efforts that affect your audiences every time a new individual comes into that. And so you can start to plan these out. And I've done this with CTS. I should probably bring over my board from the corner there, where it looks at the different kinds of campaigns that we have. And a blog post versus a content piece, all of them are about that movement. It's having those limiters in place for we're doing this much here and no more. We're going to do these tactics and no more. We're going to look at this to improve. We're not going to start from scratch each time. So the details will vary with each use of a template, but the tactics and tasks will remain the same. And when I say the details, Think about this. Your audience and your personas might change. If you're going to communicate with the same people every time, an outreach event might have those same ones, or you might have a different outreach for each persona. Your primary message will change, your talking points will certainly change, starting and end date, even the people responsible may change. You'll want to review this with each campaign, but the things like the tactics and the tasks are going to stay the same. So how do you determine the right tactics for a campaign template? Let's take a look here. We go back to our content framework and we have all of these different types of tactics. In this case, well, in most cases, the website, that conversion is kind of the core. So let's take that tactic and put it here. Let's say for an event registration campaign, and that's what we're going to call it. You can use very generic terms, but an event registration, that's the goal. You want somebody to fill out that form and say they're coming. Well, before that, you have to have some level of details. So we're going to make sure that we always have a details page. So the landing page with the form is all going to be about that conversion. And the details page before that is going to answer everyone's question. Well, before that, we should have some content that piques people's curiosity, gets them interested in this, and this can go out several weeks in advance, and that's through our media empire. And so maybe it's a blog post on that content. Maybe several weeks before Easter, you are putting a blog post out, or sorry, not Easter, Halloween. Several weeks before Halloween, you're putting a blog post out about the different ways of keeping your kids safe on Halloween as they go trick-or-treating. And then at the bottom of that, you say, if you want a safe place to come, think about coming to our trunk or treat. And you lead to your details page, which leads to the registration. Now you could have other things in your media empire that helps, emails and videos and stuff. All of that points back to your details page. Well, then you start going out to find your audience, and that's where social media comes into play. Or maybe it is an email list that is people who've registered before. You're going to where they are. But you draw them into your content. And again, your content leads to the details, which leads to the registration. Now, as you're thinking about any sort of campaign, you want to think about those follow-ups, those next steps. And so in here, we'll have a follow-up email. And I'll put some labels on this in just a second. But I like to visualize this. Again, I'm a visual person. Seeing these things, for one, reminds me how much goes into each one of these events. And if I start seeing that something is very lightweight, well, then I might be missing some opportunities. But as I get comfortable with this, I'll see that, okay, this looks about right. And it gets into that cadence of, well, people are expecting that if they see a social media post from us, there's probably a link to a blog post about this event, probably a registration page. It starts to become very familiar and almost second nature to them. So then what I suggest doing is taking all of this and putting it out there in kind of a list. You can kind of structure them together to see what types of tactics you have. Name them in different ways that are appropriate and use those names again and again. This is a campaign template. Well, I know what a blog email looks like. I know what a details email looks like. If you look at what I'm doing in this course, well, there's a regular cadence of you're going to get a reminder email the morning of the course, and you're going to get a recap email the morning after the session. So you have these regular things you're looking for. You're looking for a blog post that'll go out at 2 o'clock right after we're done with the webinar. Those kind of things, for one, it becomes very easy to implement from the communication standpoint, but also becomes easy to remember that it's coming at your end as the audience. So after you have these tactics, then you list which tasks go into them. And this is where it starts to get a little overwhelming, but I think you all see this. You see that for each Facebook post, you got to write something, you got to design something, and you got to schedule. And each one of those is not a big task, but it has to happen, and it has to happen kind of sequentially too. So if you have an idea what these are, then you start to get your to-do list. And whether it's you doing all of these things or you're splitting those tasks up, we have a wonderful team here at CPH. We have copywriters who take care of all of the writing. We have designers who take care of all the design. We have the marketers who review everything and schedule it. But if I didn't have that copywriter and designer helping me out, it would take that much longer. But they're able to do this very quickly because this is what they do and this is what they're good at. And so they can get into a regular rhythm. So it works kind of like a well-oiled machine once you set everything up in place. Now, At CPH, we call these desktop procedures. And this is when I'm going to win some brownie points with our senior leadership. We have won awards based on our processes here at CPH. And so when I was first talking about this, our president asked, are you going to talk about desktop procedures? Are you going to talk about PDCAs? I'm, yes, I am. It'll be the very last session, but I am. But this is more than anything, just something that we do here. And it can be something that you do in the church, and you're probably already doing it. When I think about how, at least at our church, our administrative assistant, and I've seen in other churches, the process that goes into the weekly bulletin, whether it's documented or not, it is a desktop procedure. These are the things we do. By this date, we have this ready to go. You know, all of the articles must be turned in Wednesday by noon. Otherwise, there's not enough time to get it into the bulletin, get the bulletins printed, get them folded, stapled, put upstairs, all of those things. You do this already. This is documenting it, especially as you look at things that you don't do every week. You're going to have this recipe for how to do it. And then comes in that last step of optimizing a desktop procedure. Now, we use what we call here PDCAs, Plan, Do, Check, Act. I like the concept a lot. Sometimes it almost seems a bit overkill because we have gotten so good at doing these that we are constantly optimizing. But what a PDCA is that you plan out what needs to change. Then you do it once or twice or 3 times and you check, you know, you have that discussion. Did this actually work? You look at the results. Did it improve things? Did it take us less time to do it this way? And then that act is to say, all right, we are definitely doing this moving forward. Change the desktop procedure. We're going to make sure that every time from now on, it's following this new process rather than this old. Again, here at CPH, we've gotten so good at doing this that it's just almost second nature to us. And it's hard to document all of these changes. That was part of what helped us win our Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award, was that we documented all of our PDCAs. Well, we are doing this on a daily basis now, where we are looking at something saying, all right, this time we're going to try that. Sometimes we might call it A/B testing, where we look at 2 different ways of doing the same thing and seeing which one's better. So that's a key thing that I want to encourage you to do. After you set up these campaign templates, make sure you are constantly reviewing them to see if they will work better in different ways. And as you look at technology, as you look at how social media is changing, sometimes those outside influences will say, all right, how are you going to implement this campaign now that you have these additional tools at your discretion? So it's a natural instinct to continue to do this. Let's pause for a second. What I have presented to you is an idealistic scenario of having everything mapped out on a calendar, knowing exactly what's going to come up in the year, laying out exactly what you're going to do to address it, and doing it in such a way that you can operate like a well-oiled machine. And again, that is very idealistic. And I know that that is not how life in the church goes. I don't think that's how life anywhere goes. So let's talk a little bit about unplanned communications. So what happens when things don't go as planned? Let's go back to our communications calendar. We have everything nice and neat and structured, and then all of a sudden something happens. Put a little explosion there down in September. And now we have a surprise big priority that we have to address. And everything else just kind of fades into the background. Now, we wouldn't know anything like this as we live in a world of pandemics and rioting and protesting. And just when we're about to get back into the church, now we have churches that are being vandalized or communities that are being torn apart. How do we handle those things? Well, that's a good question, and there's no good answer to that. But I've got a few pieces of advice. First off, choose the most appropriate templates for that campaign. If it's a campaign, I put in crises. A lot of times, right now we're in some very unique times. A lot of times these are just a new event that comes up. But if you view everything like a campaign, whether that is a low-key, oh, somebody forgot to tell you about this coming up, or a big thing where everybody in our community or in our country is facing this. If you go back to what you have as a campaign, you say, what's the most appropriate one? Well, now you have your to-do list. You're not creating something from the ground up. It may not have been designed for that purpose, but it'll fit. Figure out which one is the most appropriate template. If you need to make adjustments, you can, but the more familiar it is to you, if you've already been doing this, the more easily you'll be able to drop everything else and focus on this, because you're not trying to come up with a plan. You already have a plan, you're just fitting it for the situation. You're changing the details. You got to revise the timing to fit the schedules. But once you have that, now you know what your deadlines are. You know exactly how much time you can spend on each one of these things. And so your ideal scenario of saying, all right, well, typically we do a video and we do it in about 2 weeks lead time. Well, now we've got a day. That's going to tell you what level you can get into in terms of that video. It might change how you approach it, but you'll still have that template of how to go about and what actions to take. Set proper expectations on the results based on that timeline. You now have your quality standards, and that kind of goes into what I was just talking about. Once you know that you have 1/10 of the time to get this done than you typically do, well, then you have your expectations on the quality. It's not going to be the same. That means that you don't have to spend all of your time working on that just to try to get back to what your standards are. Change your standards based on the criteria of that event. Do the best you can, given the circumstances. People are forgiving. They will know that you put your best effort forward, and especially in times where it was a surprise, they're going to be more understanding. Now, if this is something where you drop the ball, well, you're going to feel bad about that, and all of a sudden you have to rush and remember to advertise your Christmas services. That's not really a surprise. That falls under a different category. But if this is something that was just planned, that came up out of the blue, people are going to understand if you're doing your best. And you can put yourself into a position by planning ahead with these campaign templates so that your best is better than it might otherwise be in those situations. All right, let's jump into, in our last few minutes, a few time-saving tools, and then we'll wrap up with the session and with this course. I could probably spend all day talking about tools. I've done some different sessions on that, and I'd be curious if this is an area that you guys would like to see more. I'm not sure exactly how to share this, but I know a lot of the questions that I have, I start to point back to these tools. So feel free as I'm talking, if you've got ideas on what you'd like to see, drop them into the questions. I'd love to figure out if there's a way where I can provide some training for you in these areas without being in the same kind of format. I'm still playing around with that idea. But some of the tools that I really like is a shared calendar, because it keeps everyone on the same page for timing. And what I mean by this is not a calendar on the wall that everybody can look at and see there's that event, but something where it can take your communication efforts and put it into a usable calendar format. I've seen many different bad examples of this. I've seen like Google or Outlook calendars where individual tactics became all-day events and campaigns became multi-day events. And what you're left with is a very large and cluttered calendar, and you share it, but it doesn't actually serve the purpose. What I like to be able to see is kind of like what I demonstrated before, was a high-level visual of where these things are, so you can kind of get a feel for what's going on the calendar, but then you have an opportunity to dig into the details. I love to-do lists, and there are numerous to-do lists that I've tried. Several years ago, when we were looking at redoing things for our marketing team and how do we manage our workload, I went through 14 different project management software applications, started free trials, did demos, the whole 9 yards to figure out which ones that I liked. And then we did it again last year as we were preparing for this year's communication efforts. And where we ended up was a little bit different than we had been previously, but I still like both of those tools, and I'll share them in a minute. But having a to-do list app, whether it's on your desktop or on your phone or some way to see exactly what's required of each person on the team, or if you're a team of one, what's required of you right now, today, and in what priority, is going to be key to knowing those next steps, because the tasks lead to tactics and the tactics lead to a completed campaign. So you get down to that lowest level of work, and if you get all of those done, you've completed the project. And then finally, an assets database. Asset databases make it easy to find the right file when you need it. And there's so many different options for that. The more closely it's tied in with your tasks, the better. But this is one where I think you can have some disconnection between where you're working and what you're working on. Even just a shared network drive, if it's structured properly, it makes it really easy to find those different assets that you need. And by assets, I mean things like files, copy that somebody has written, examples from last time, or digital templates, anything that is a creative element that you'll repurpose time and time again. So my preference for tools goes in this order. First and foremost, I love Airtable. Airtable.com is the URL. I am not paid to talk about any of these. These are just what we use here at CPH, or at least Airtable is what we use here at CPH. I use in my church. In fact, we working with one of our developers here at CPH, he's using Airtable and recommended it for worship registration at his church, and that's what we're doing at our church, where we basically just created a registration form so that people can sign up for worship, as we're limiting numbers. And I've been able to train people at my church how to use it. Our head elder has done a great job of learning it, and now he does the assigned seating. That's one of the ways we're handling worship. The thing about Airtable that I love is that it can do any of the three things that I mentioned, and it can be very flexible. Now, there's a bit of a learning curve. You have to understand what a database does. Most tools that you use are built on a database that is invisible to you. What you are using is the front-end interface. And so while the database is present, you're not setting it up. In Airtable, you are. So again, it's a little bit of a learning curve. I don't want to make it sound like it's a plug and play sort of solution, but because it is that structure of a database without the user interface, you get to set it up exactly how it works for your church. And that's what I like. We've set it up differently here at CPH than we have at churches. I even use it for personal things. So it's a great tool. I can't recommend it enough. I just want to caution you, there's a little bit of a learning curve. It's not the easiest to pick up and play with. Now, Asana is a little bit different. Asana has grown over the years, but at its core, it's a to-do list. Now, it provides the calendar tools, and it also provides the asset management. And so it has all of the aspects. I use this for my personal and my work to-do list. I like the interface better than what I can put together in Airtable. And so I've made the decision to kind of split out my individual tasks and my marketing tasks. My marketing tasks are all done automatically in Airtable. My individual tasks are in Asana. It's just got a nice, clean user interface, and honestly, I've been comfortable with it. And that's, to me, a real big thing. As I was testing out, Asana is what I picked when I explored the 14 different project management software. I picked Asana over Basecamp. Those are my final two, and that was before I even knew about Airtable. But Asana versus Basecamp, and based on just how easy and comfortable it was, I chose Asana. But then lastly, I recommend the G Suite, the G Suite from Google. Google has a fantastic way of doing many different things. Their user interface is nice and clean. I am an Android guy, so if you see my phone, it'll always be an Android. So I'm a little biased, but they have a lot of different tools. They've got a lot of great things for churches and schools in terms of Google Classroom and user management. You can easily use their tools for the three things I mentioned too. Now, Google Calendar is not as ideal as I would like for a calendar tool. And Google Keep allows you to do a lot of the same things as the others. That's definitely third on my list, but I like how well it's integrated together. Now, I can talk about a bunch of other tools, but I don't want to overwhelm you or even lead you astray. I think these are ones that I can stand by my recommendations. So the TLDR for today: establish a communications calendar for your ministry. Build campaigns with optimized tactics and tasks. As you build out these campaigns, you're setting up these desktop procedures, and you're going to have this process in place for future efforts. So establish the process and the tools you're going to use to work quickly and efficiently so that you can address those things that come up out of the blue that you're not expecting. All right, if you'd like to dive deeper, take a look at our Concordia Technology blog. This week, I'm using the ingredients of a detailed church communication strategy. You can tell food's been on my mind lately. Instead of the ingredients of a campaign, these are really, this is a review of everything we've covered in the course. And so it's a quick and easy reminder of the different tools that I've provided during this training course. So that should be actually right at this instant, should be publishing. You should be able to find it at our blog. And it's a good recap of everything we've talked about here in this course. There's also the campaigns worksheet. Now this provides a few sample templates, but more than anything, it's hopefully to help you get thinking in this way. So you can download that in our handouts in the GoToWebinar panel. You should be able to see that there under campaigns worksheet. I also included the last 4 handouts in the panel if you don't have those already. We will be sharing this in our resource center coming up tomorrow. Now the resource center will remain available indefinitely. It might change a little bit in appearance as I reorder the items and I make it publicly available. So just know that there might be some of those changes coming, but all of the materials for the course will be available for you. You'll be able to access them pretty much anytime until someone in the future takes it down, but I won't be taking it down. We'll make this available. Love to hear your feedback on if these were the right resources to make available or if there were some different things that we could have done. Now, the Facebook group where I've been sharing some of this, that will be archived on June 30th. I find sometimes that the Facebook group is easier to access these resources, and so that's why we created this and put it there. I didn't want to continually share each one of these things on our Facebook page because that's not appropriate for all of our audiences. So we created this one group, and the group will be archived at the end of the month. Now, because we'll have the Resource Center available, I don't feel bad doing that because you'll still be able to access everything. But if you want to have any discussion or questions, I'd be sure to put those out there before June 30th. Next, I'd love to hear your feedback. Like I mentioned at the start of the session today, this would be a great opportunity for me to learn what we could have done better, what you really liked, how you're putting this into place. My plan is to share this information, share the recordings, and try to get it to anybody who wasn't able to attend the course live. And if you share with me some of your recommendations, or if you really want to encourage others to do that, writing a review and sharing it with me, I could put that on the page as well. This is a free course. We're not going to charge for it. Don't feel obligated to do any of that. This is just to let me know if it was helpful and if there's things that we could do to improve it. Now, again, it is free, and if you would like to thank me for doing this, I encourage you to take a look at Concordia Technology Solutions and our church software. It's never been my intention to make this course about a sales pitch, but it is our software that pays for me to be able to do things like that. So if you haven't looked at our products, I'd encourage you to do so. But again, this is not a bait and switch. This is just the way that we present things to help you in your ministry. It's all paid for by our software. All right, now let's get into the Q&A. I went past my 55 minutes, but I'm happy to stick around. Looks like we've got a number of different questions there. So pardon me 1 second while I take a drink and start looking at those questions. All right, we will go up to the top of the list. Oh, it looks like there's a few issues with audio. I do apologize for that. Hopefully you're able to get that figured out. Lori said that the hardest topic for her has been the persona generation. To grow our church, need to do homework to know our audience. How? Hire consultants? That's not a bad way to go about doing it. That is a tough thing, but I would encourage you not to overthink it at the beginning. I think as you dig into it, you will certainly know what you don't know the more you go into it. But at its very core, understanding who is part of your church is something that should come naturally to those of you who are either serving in the church in a paid or volunteer capacity. The people outside of your church, that's going to be hard, because you don't necessarily know the demographics of your community. You don't know, what their needs are. So start with the people in your church. You're going to kind of work up those muscles of identifying the different groups. That's going to be a hard enough task to get started. But if you use your goals to kind of frame where you make those division points and you focus on the people that you truly do know, then I think it'll be easier to go outside. That's a very quick answer to the question, which I'm sure will not answer it fully for you. But I think if I could say anything, my encouragement to you would be starting it is more than enough at the beginning. I think it'll go a long way as you start to work through those details. And the great thing about this, especially with personas, is that it's only used by a few people in your church. This is not something you're making publicly available. So if you are continually iterating on it and improving it, it might drive the people around you a little bit crazy, but it's not going to impact all of your communications. So just continue to work on it over time. Now, in terms of consultants, there are a lot of different agencies that can help you with this. This is a common task within marketing. There's some people who are really good at walking you through that process. Now, you will have to pay for them. That's one of the challenges, but you could get some really good help out there. All right. Lori also asked, the calendar template is great. Is there a PowerPoint template available for this? I've had issues sharing the PowerPoints. For one, there's some copyright stuff involved with that. Two, the fonts and graphics have not always come across. I've been sharing them as PDFs, but if you send me your email address, well, I guess I have it because you signed up for it. I'll try to send that to you directly and we'll see if it works. I can't promise that it'll work. All right, Heather says, and a very good question, doesn't the church year start with Advent? You can also add Lent and Advent as key dates. Absolutely, it does. What I was doing, though, is working my way backwards from those key events and trying to divide the year in nice, even segments. You can divide it however works best for you, but I think that it would help if you look at those tentpoles and say, the first week of Advent really isn't a tentpole. It's certainly Christmas that is. Leading up to that, what's the tentpole before that? That kind of defines your season. It's going to be tough to work on multiple major events at the same time. I mean, thank goodness Easter and Christmas are so far apart. Can you imagine working on those at the same time? You probably can if we've had an early Easter. If we have an Easter that falls in the mid to late March range, it's about as early as it comes, that gets really tight going from Christmas to Lent so quickly. But it's still a couple months. And so that's what I would encourage you. And that's why I didn't want to start right at the beginning of Lent or Easter, because you can only have so many. One way of referring to them, and I didn't get into this in the course, but it would be called sprints. Sprints meaning times where you're really pushing forward. And so that's why I didn't start with that. But again, these are tools. If you'd like to start your calendar with that, go for it. I'd be really curious to see how it works out. All right, Heather also says, how did this change with online virtual services and types of social media campaigns? I don't know if the calendar would change too much. Certainly the tactics that you use would change. And so as you think about what is falling out, some of your print pieces that you do, or maybe the way you do your presentations like slide decks, may have changed because you don't have as much to communicate. There's not as many physical activities going on. And so it allows you to spend some more time doing digital communications. That said, I don't know if there's anything that you would do now that would not also be appropriate when we're meeting in person. So as you're thinking about forms of digital communication, it's so key to what we do every day now that I would never ignore that just because we meet in person. Now, you might have some things where digital signups are now a thing, where before you would just assume people are coming based on their first sign up, and now you have to send them out a Zoom invitation and all of that. So there's some of those aspects of it that would change. But from a strategy, I think your goals are still the same. Maybe that location is a little bit different. Rather than getting people to come to your service, you're now trying to get them to come watch your live stream. But that was kind of the destination anyways, is to get them to come to your website. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't focused on the COVID-19 pandemic too much in this, because while it does change some of the details, the strategy really hasn't changed at all. All right, next up. Do you have a policy and procedures manual for tactics and details? What we have done is I've written some explanations on how you set up campaigns what goes in what field. One of the things with Airtable is you can add little like explainer boxes telling what each thing meant, and that's where most of that stays. Because it's kind of a fairly set structure, a lot of it's self-explanatory. So we do have some details, but I wouldn't go so far as calling it a manual, because it's not, it's definitely not very thorough, because again, they're self-explanatory. Heather asked, what template in Airtable did you use for church registration? We custom created the template ourselves. It's something that I could look at sharing. There's probably some work to do, and if it's helpful to you, let me know in the chat or in the questions, and just say, yeah, I'd love to see that template, and I can see if I can easily make it a template. It won't be in what they call the Airtable universe, but we could make it shareable. But I want to make sure that enough people do, because it's going to take some effort to put that together. All right. Heather asked the challenging question of, what is the greatest mistake you've made on a campaign, and how did you fix it so it was improved for the next rollout? Probably the biggest mistake that I've made, haven't made really big ones, but probably the ones that are the worst is when you put the wrong date or the wrong link on something when you first announce it. I've done that before. Now, surprisingly, it actually worked out to our advantage, because what we did was we've done this a couple times, not too many. We've learned from it pretty well. That's where that proofreading comes in. I can only think of 3 times, and with quite a bit of time in between those when we've had that. But what we've done is we've sent out an oops email. It's all been email. Social media is pretty easy if you make a mistake, because you can go edit the post pretty quickly. Email's the hard part. But we've sent out an oops email, and it's amazing the response you get when you send an email with the subject line that says, oops, we made a mistake, because everybody wants to find out what mistake you made. And the first time we made it, we were so embarrassed. We're like, we got to get an email out. We got to clarify this. And our response rate on the oops email was so much better than the other one. Now, I'm not encouraging you to intentionally make mistakes so you can send out an oops email, because I don't think that's fair. That's kind of deceptive. But if you do make a mistake, own up to it, send it out, try to create it, try to fix it quickly. I think you'll get a good response for it. And people like when you're genuine anyways, when you say, yeah, I messed up. This has probably happened to you. I mean, how many people have sent an email to the wrong person or a reply all when they didn't mean to? So it's kind of like that. Those are the biggest mistakes. I think I've probably, when we talk about sins of commission versus sins of omission, probably had far more omission mistakes where I look back at something and I say, that actually went well. I should have done more and had it go even better. Those are the kinds when it's kind of that too late sort of thing where I didn't do enough and I probably had the time to do it. Dun, dun, dun. Let's see, there's a lot of people saying thank you. I appreciate that. Been very enjoyable to do this course. All right, Charles says, do you know of any church sites that have used a chatbot? I don't. That is not something that I've seen done very well. Now, there's a lot of tools available for chatbots. I think one of the biggest challenges with chatbots is well, there's a couple ways you can approach it. If it's truly a bot, you can set it up so that there's a workflow where people can ask different questions and it'll automatically answer them. Or if it's about chatting with a human being, there's a lot of great resources for that too. I think the biggest thing you want to do is make sure that you're clear about whether you are chatting with a robot and it's all automated or chatting with a human being. And I think that latter one is going to be really hard at a church. I think companies that do it, they have teams of people who are always aware if there's a chat coming in. Churches just don't have that luxury. So I think you could do some really cool things with the chatbot, as long as you make sure to clarify that it's automated and that people should not expect to get a live response. But it's a quick kind of Q&A sort of way of interacting with your audience. I haven't seen churches do that. I would guess it's a matter of priorities. I don't think chatbots have taken off in the same way in the same way as they expected. I don't think it's replaced communication as quickly as they thought. It's kind of like ebooks. Like ebooks has not fully replaced print, books. It's kind of plateaued at under 50%, slightly under 50%. I think chatbots are that same way. The people who like chatbots will use it, and you've got a lot of people who are doing that, but it has certainly not replaced all forms of communication in that way. So that would be my thoughts, kind of just off the fly there. All right. Celicia is asking, I may have missed this last week, but what website platform is your favorite? Currently we use Wix, but I don't find it as cell phone friendly. Any thoughts here? Yes, I do have a thought. It is our church manager, our church website builder, part of our church management software suite. It's called Church 360 Unite. Now that's the one that I work on with the team. I'm very much biased. I think it's a fantastic tool. It's very easy to use. It's developed for an audience who are not web developers. So if you know how to code, if you know how to put all those tools together, that's probably not the best tool for you. Then I'd say something just like WordPress. But WordPress, in my mind, is a bit beyond what most churches will need, what they want to do, unless you have somebody who knows how to use it. So that's why we built Church 360 Unite. It's available at our concordiatechnology.org website. I won't turn this into a sales pitch, but that is what I would recommend. All right, Richard's saying, do you use a CRM software application such as Salesforce? If so, which one? We use HubSpot here. HubSpot has a fantastic CRM. They are a marketing automation software first and foremost, but they added a CRM, probably 5+ years ago now. It's a great tool. It can be expensive, especially in the marketing side of things. What I recommend for churches would be our church management software. It's a great way for you to track your interactions. It's called Church 360 Members. But again, I'm not going to try to turn this into a sales pitch. All right, let's see. What else do we have? You didn't mention with Heather's asking about communications with videos and Zoom. You could add these forms. Absolutely. I mentioned those a few weeks ago, as I don't really see those as communication tactics as much as messaging systems. Now, you're right that they are very much used right now. But when you think about it, it's kind of just replacing in-person communication like you would have at a worship service or a meeting or something like that. It's not necessarily something that you push out. You push out the invitation to it, but it's at a scheduled time. So I don't see that fitting in the same way. It would kind of be like scheduling a room at the church. You're scheduling a room online. So there's obviously it's a valuable tool, but it's kind of like a photocopier where it's more of a tool than a tactic. That's my opinion on those kind of things, but it's definitely something to look at. It just was a little bit outside the scope of this course. Have you seen some, Gary's got a good question. Have you seen some media messages from churches that have backfired in regard to recent chaos we have experienced in our world? Absolutely. I think people are a little bit more understanding with churches than with individuals, but I think you can look through the news and social media and see all sorts of messages that have backfired right now. I think as a church, we need to focus on sharing scripture, sharing what Christ has given us first and foremost. We can't go wrong when we point back to the gospel, as long as we are pointing back to it in the right context. Certainly you could skew scripture to fit whatever ways if you just cut out the portions of it that surround things. But I think if we are honestly pointing everything back to Christ, that's where we need to be as a church. That's who our voice is. Now, there's a lot of other messages that can be shared, and depending on how well you know your audience, you might be able to use the words that respond best. But I think right now it's a very tough time, and there's a lot of, well, obviously there's a lot of emotions running high, and what we need is the gospel first and foremost. So if we're going to prioritize anything, if we're going to share any message right now, sharing the gospel is what we should be doing. And that goes beyond just right now, but I think especially right now, people need to hear that Christ died for all of us. That's why we exist, is to share that message. What better time than now when we have such a hurting world? So that's my thoughts on that. I could probably go much more detail, but I'll stay with that. Let's see. All right, what other questions? There's a lot of good feedback here. I won't comment on all of those, but I do see a number of people with the Airtable sign-up form. So I'll see what I can figure out. Carol did ask a question about Airtable. Is it a big expense? Not real big. The free version is what I use mostly. Now for CPH, we pay for it, and I think it works out to about $20 per user per month, which is definitely a bit pricey. But as an organization and as such a critical tool, it works for us. I don't know if you necessarily need that at the church level. It depends on how you're using it. So it's not what I would call cheap unless you're on the free plan. All right, let's see. Do you have campaign submission or post-event analyses? Ronald is asking that. That's a good question. That is something that we have struggled with here at CPH. And I say that because we're rather complex. We have a lot of different things that we do. We have done a number of different things before. So in our campaigns, we have the communication side of things. Was it effective in getting the word out? Now we have the business side of things. Was it effective in accomplishing our goals? The business side of things has had a lot of flux in terms of how we present that information. On the marketing and the communication side of things, our tools themselves, such as HubSpot, have gotten so good at providing that feedback. We just tend to go in there and see how it is. HubSpot is a fantastic software that not only allows us to see what that individual tactic did, it allows us to benchmark against our other tactics, see where it's at. So most of what we do now is in there. If it's a print piece or something like that, then we have other ways of doing it. So we don't have a real good standard, partly because the tools have continued to change, partly because of the complexity. But we've done a lot. I mean, everything from single page PDF printouts to presentations that we do in a large group setting to everything in between. So we don't have a good process yet because we've been optimizing it so much. But I think we are definitely at a point where we have a much better understanding on a day-to-day basis on how our efforts are going, that we don't need to do it in such a formal manner. All right, let's see. Yeah, Heather, you just said it would be nice to be able to see the questions others are asking. That's one of the things that is a downside to this. Last time I did the course, I did it using Facebook Live. And that was good for a number of things. On the presenter side, it was a little bit tougher switching between slides and videos and all of that. Did allow everybody to see the comments, but I had some problems with getting the comments in the right order to answer questions, so it wasn't quite as structured. This, on the other hand, works out well for me, but it doesn't work out as well for you guys to see those questions. So that's why I try to say them out loud, but yeah, I agree. I wish there's a better way of doing that. I think I got all of the questions for today. There's a lot of good feedback in here, so I appreciate that. There's a number of people asking for the template, so I think what I'll do is try to put that together and share it either in the Facebook group, or I may even make a blog post out of it for CTS. If there's something I missed, feel free to email me. Again, I appreciate all that good feedback. And Heather just suggested perhaps adding an FAQ. I think that could be a good idea as well. I'm looking at different ways of sharing this information. A lot of the questions I got during the last time I did the course went into the course materials this time. Now, I don't plan to represent this course again in the near future, but it's definitely going to be something that we're looking at in other ways in the coming months, not necessarily in a course format, but maybe in something else. All right, well, with that, 25 minutes over. I do apologize. We do have a lot of people still here, so allow me to thank you for sticking with us during this course, for asking all these great questions, sharing your comments and feedback. I really appreciate it. Again, feel free to reach out to me at any time at my email address, or at least for the next few months before I move into my part-time role here, but that email address will still be valid for a while. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day, and God's blessings to you.